So I had a moment this week where it hit me how close Election Day is. And it was when I went to the grocery store and I bought half and half and I saw that it expired after Election Day. And I'm curious if either of you have had this experience where something happened and you're like, oh my gosh, this thing we've been talking about for years is about to happen.
When I'm buying half and half, I'm usually not thinking about anything. It's the most mindless portion of my day. That's the one time I can tune myself out.
Yeah, I feel like for me, it's just people finally starting to care about Senate races. I'm like, oh, I guess it's close. It's about... So no one cares about Senate races until 3 days before Election Day.
Welcome to the campaign moment on this Friday, September 27th. I'm Elahe Izadi, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're also joined this week by Liz Goodwin, who covers the Senate for the Post. Hey, Liz.
Hello.
Today, we are going to talk about the Senate, including what Democrats are doing to try to keep control of the chamber. You know, we talk a lot about the presidential race, but talking about the Senate is also important because whoever wins the White House also needs Congress to make their agenda a reality. So we'll dig into a couple of Senate races that are competitive and could make the difference here, where things are really changing fast, like in Montana, Ohio, and yes, even Texas.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about the indictment of New York City Mayor Eric Adams, who was charged this week with bribery, wire fraud, and seeking illegal campaign contributions from foreign sources. And we're also going to do a little preview of next week's big vice presidential debate between Senator J.D. Vance and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz.
So let's first start with those Senate races. Liz, we're excited to have you on because you cover the Senate. You know so much about it. For those who maybe aren't paying as close attention, Democrats right now narrowly control the Senate, and senators go up for election every 6 years. Got to do the Schoolhouse Rocks thing. But the way it broke down this year is that Democrats are playing defense for those Senate seats in almost all of the most competitive races. So, Liz, just tell me about the vibe in the Senate right now. I feel like you would know best. You have a pulse on that chamber. How does it feel in the Senate right now?
Yeah, so this was their last week before they all go home and just kind of basically fight for their political lives on the Democrat side, because they're the ones with all the incumbents this year who are just trying to hang on to their seats. And, you know, Jon Tester, the Democratic senator from Montana, he's the most vulnerable. If you look at those polls that he's facing, it's just really not looking great. And so just kind of picking up on his mood a little bit. He's always very jokey with reporters. You know, he's been in the Senate for a while now, so he's very comfortable there and has, a lot of alliances and knows a lot of people. And I feel like there's kind of a strain on him the past few weeks, and he's just a little bit less jokey and wanting to talk and wanting to explain all of his positions. And he's been in an awkward thing where he's sort of not embracing Kamala Harris. He hasn't endorsed her, which is a little bit of an awkward position for him, I think. I don't think anyone thinks that, just given his voting record and history, that he doesn't want to vote for her or whatever. So he's just kind of tying himself into knots to make this reelection happen. On the Republican side, they're not all rainbows, even though it's a great map for them. Steve Daines, who runs the Republican campaign arm, the Senate campaign arm, the NRSC, he's been complaining that Kamala Harris transferred all this money to the Democrat Senate arm, but Trump has not done the same for them. So he's not calling out Trump directly, but he's talking a lot about their money woes. So you would think they would be having a party at this point. And it's not quite that. I think they're feeling good about Montana, and that's all they need to flip the chamber. But, it's a year where you could really stack up some seats, and I think they're feeling less good about that at this point.
Just to chime in here, Democrats have a 51-49 majority in the Senate, but West Virginia is one of the states they're defending where Senator Joe Manchin, former Democrat, now independent, is retiring, and that state is very likely to go Republican. So we're essentially starting with a 50-50 tie before we talk about all of these other races. And the funny thing is here that Democrats have probably been polling better than you would have expected in these Senate races across the country. But the map was just set up from the very beginning to be extremely difficult for Democrats. They were defending basically all 8 of the most vulnerable seats. These were 3 red states, 5 presidential swing states. And so it creates a situation where Democrats have done pretty well in these races. They're like winning in all of these swing states, according to the polls. But because they have to defend states like Montana, it just creates a situation where there was almost no margin for error.
So let's talk about that one tipping point state, Montana, a little bit more. Jon Tester, he's been in the Senate for a while, despite Montana being so red. This year, he's being challenged by Republican Tim Sheehy. Liz, can you tell me a little bit about who Sheehy is?
Yes, so Steve Daines, who runs the Senate campaign arm, he's the other Montana senator. So that it makes it even more personal, basically, trying to unseat Tester. And he basically handpicked Tim Sheehy. This is really his recruit. And he's got this really amazing resume. He's a Navy SEAL. He started his own business. He's got, a nice family. He's much younger than Tester. I think on paper, he was a really good pick, and they all felt really great about him, especially because Republicans have been really trying to convince wealthy people to run because they have this problem where they can't raise as much money as Democrats.
And is he wealthy?
And he's wealthy, yes, because he has his own company.
Meanwhile, I like Jon Tester likes to point out he gets $10 haircuts. So
yeah, I think so. That's what I was going to get at. Is I feel like the contrast between them that Tester is leaning the most into, I think, is that he's like, I'm from here, I'm real. I'm on my, tractor and like on my dirt farm, and I got my hair cut and I'm missing some fingers from a meat grinder accident. This is how he's won past races. He's really leaned into his likability and his authenticity. And so all of his ads there, especially at the beginning, were like bio ads, like pictures of his grandparents in Montana, like just really staking down, like, I'm from here. This is me. And Sheehy moved to Montana later in life. He grew up in Minnesota. And so he's playing off this trope of like rich people who move to Montana, they buy up all the land, they make it more expensive for people like us who are normal people. So it's really like a personality race, or Tester's trying to make it one, because if you make it a policy race, people in Montana, where Trump won by 16 points last time are like, wait, what did you vote for? Huh? Like there's not a lot that he's winning on policy-wise except for like abortion. That's one that I think a lot of people there are more uncomfortable with the Republican Party line. But otherwise, he's not really a good fit for the state policy-wise at all. So it's become a personality race.
And exactly how close right now is this race? We're talking Friday morning.
There was a poll that came out that had Sheehy up 8 points. And so that was like, whoa. However, even like the Republicans, their internal polling, it shows it a much closer race, more like 3-4 points.
Okay.
And that's what I've heard from a lot of different groups that are doing their own polling in there. They consider it still like a margin of error race, but he's never on the other side. Like
Tester's
I don't think
never
anyone,
on the other side.
Yeah, I don't think anyone has a poll where Tester's up lately.
Erin, I know that you've talked a lot about how candidates backed by Trump often underperform. I understand that Trump backs Sheehy. Why do you think it seems like Sheehy is doing well here?
I think it's worth noting that, as Liz pointed out, this is a state that Donald Trump won by 16 points. So Tim Sheehy leading by 3 points, yes, he's facing an incumbent senator, which is more difficult, but that's not an overwhelming margin that Republicans would like to be running up in a state like this. But at the end of the day, this is a red state. It is a presidential year. And when you're running in a state that Trump won by 16 points and Trump's on the ballot too, that becomes very difficult for a federal race that's just below that on the ballot.
Yeah. So, okay, Montana, very important. That could be the whole ball game right there. I hate to use a sports analogy when we're talking about a body of government that is responsible for passing a lot of legislation. But let's say Democrats hold on to Montana. There are still some other states where they could still lose, and one of them is Ohio. So in Ohio, we have Republican Senate candidate Bernie Moreno. He made some comments about women and abortion at a town hall last week. He said things about suburban women singularly focused on abortion. NBC4, the local affiliate in Columbus, obtained the audio from someone in the audience. Let's take a listen to that.
You know, the left has a lot of single-issue voters. Sadly, by the way, there's a lot of suburban women. A lot of suburban women that are like, listen, abortion's it. If I can't have an abortion in this country whenever I want, I will vote for anybody else. Okay, a little crazy, by the way, but especially for women that are like past 50, I'm thinking to myself, that's an issue for you.
So it's a little hard to hear, but the part that stood out to me was him saying it's crazy to him that women over 50 would care about abortion, the insinuation having to do with, you know, postmenopausal women. Why would you even care about abortion? Because you can't get pregnant. There is a lot to unpack there. We could talk for a while about that, but Moreno is running against Democratic incumbent Sherrod Brown. How do you think these comments about abortion will impact the race?
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine like a worse thing to say. Like, it's almost unbelievable, honestly. And this is part of why Brown is doing well in the state. Like, that's a state where Moreno is running way behind Trump in the polling we have so far. And Brown, it's close, but Brown is ahead in most polling. And, you know, Ohio's not one of those states where there is an abortion referendum this year, which really like gets people out and gets people motivated. So reminding people of this issue when, you know, you would hope that you would just be like completely sitting on it. You know, it's just sort of like you just shouldn't even be talking about this. This is your worst issue. And then to insult women on top of it and make fun of a woman for caring about abortion rights if she's old. I mean, it's the caricature of what Democrats are trying to paint Republicans as. And he just said it out loud.
Yeah, this for me was the moment that I think some Republicans feared and a lot of Democrats anticipated. There's been a lot of talk, and we've talked on this podcast about these Republican Senate candidates in recent history who have not run well, who have underperformed because they've been more extreme or just bad candidates or something. This has cost Republicans seats in recent elections, including the 2022 election. It's probably cost them control at the Senate, depending on how you slice it in recent years. And when Bernie Moreno was winning the Republican primary, there was concern about whether this guy was up to the task or he would create problems for the party. And
sorry, Aaron, why did people think he might cause problems?
Just that he was more like he had taken hardline positions on abortion in the past. He was kind of a new candidate who didn't have a lot of experience, just kind of didn't seem to have everything that you'd want in a candidate that would be appealing to swing voters. And so I think this is the moment where they're like, you know, what are you doing? Like, why would you even go there? You know, they've kind of tried to play off this comment as if he was joking. And so I think if, you know, Ohio might not wind up being the decisive state in this election, but I think as far as moments that we could be talking about in a little bit more than a month after these results come in, this could be a pretty significant one.
So, you know, we're talking about how generally this is a tough year for Democrats trying to hold on to control of the Senate. You know, even if Harris wins, they could lose it if they just lose Montana. You know, Ohio is still up for grabs. But now I read in your story this week, Aaron, that Democrats are turning their attention to two other states, and they are making multi-million-dollar TV investments in Florida and Texas to try to pick up Senate seats there, which, I don't know, feels crazy to me because I tend to think of those states, Texas in particular, as solidly Republican. I remember being a political reporter during the Obama years, going to Texas, talking to Democrats about their pipe dream of turning Texas blue. Aaron, could this actually happen? Like, what are they thinking?
I mean, your reaction is not wrong. These are difficult states. We have seen polling that shows these races are actually pretty close. Like, Texas and Florida are actually polling more competitively than these presidential swing states. Rick Scott in Florida and Ted Cruz in Texas.
And those are Republicans, and you're saying they're polling more closely than Senate races in presidential swing states.
Yeah, these are Republican incumbents are generally leading by like 3, 4, 5 points in these polls. I think there is a real question, though, about whether Democrats can get over the top. Like in Texas especially, it's one thing to be competitive and, be Beto O'Rourke in 2018, who only lost to Cruz by 3 points. But it's another to actually get over the top because Democrats haven't won statewide in Texas since 1994. Not a single statewide race in that state. Florida is also trending Republican in recent years. The statewide races in 2022 were lopsided there. I think there's a real question in this Democratic investment in these states, how much it's really about them thinking they can win versus how much they think they might just need to take on new states because they might lose in Montana. And if they do lose in Montana, they need to win somewhere else in order to offset that, to be able to have the majority. And so we'll have to see how the investment pans out here, how much Democrats actually spend in these states versus kind of a momentary investment to see what happens. But I think it does reflect the tough math for them and the fact that Montana hasn't gone according to plan.
Yeah, I think to me, it would represent like a more serious effort if they picked one of those states because they're both such expensive states to advertise in.
Yeah,
so if they were like,
too.
Listen, we're going all in Florida. We think like Scott is uniquely weak as a incumbent and there's an abortion initiative on there. And so that's one thing, or the opposite with Texas because they think Colin Allred's a really good candidate, whatever. Allred is the Democratic candidate running against Ted Cruz in Texas. But the fact that it's like, we're going to put a few million in these states, it doesn't feel as serious to me at this point. It's almost like a messaging thing of like, look at us on offense. But I think it's always really hard to like flip a state like that where the fundamentals are just not on your side. Even just trying to get Larry Hogan to be a senator in Maryland where he's very popular.
He's a Republican.
Yeah, he's a Republican. It's a blue state. That's just always really hard.
And I feel like Democrats have tried to go after Ted Cruz for so long because he's not particularly popular among his colleagues in the Senate, at least. That's what I gather from all the reporting out there.
My favorite quote about Ted Cruz is actually from Al Franken, the former Minnesota senator, who said, I like Ted Cruz a lot more than pretty much everybody else in the Senate, and I hate Ted Cruz.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah. If I could throw out another Senate race that we haven't talked about yet, but I think we
one
should
more
at
to
least
take us
mention.
out of the Senate
One
conversation.
More. Okay. This is it's not my favorite race, but it's becoming one of my favorite races, which is in Nebraska. And, we talked about how Democrats are spending money in Florida and Texas. Well, Republicans are now spending some money to shore up Senator Deb Fischer in Nebraska. It's not too much money at this point, but this is an interesting race where we don't have a lot of high-quality polling, but what we have seen is very close. And it's not Deb Fischer against a Democrat, but it's Deb Fischer against an independent named Dan Osborne, who people think is running a pretty good campaign. We've seen this before in recent years where Democrats basically don't put somebody up and they just let the independent run. And a lot of times it polls pretty close, but then the Republican kind of takes over towards the end of the race. But at least for now, it looks like Republicans are feeling the need to send a little bit of money Deb Fischer's way to make sure that one doesn't get away from them.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's pretty embarrassing to have to do that in such a red state, too. So, yeah, the fact that they're doing that has got to hurt a little bit.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's take a pause here because after the break, I want to get into why Donald Trump likes the indicted Democratic mayor of New York City. And we'll have a preview of the first and only vice presidential debate. We'll be right back. So there's this other big story that happened this week, and that is the indictment of New York City's mayor, Democrat Eric Adams. This is the first time an incumbent mayor in New York City has been criminally charged. Obviously, this is a big story in New York City, but I'm wondering what, if anything, does this mean politically beyond New York City?
It's been really interesting to me to see the reactions to this. Like, you would think that a Democratic mayor in a big city being indicted, Republicans would go, well, look at this corruption in this big, blue city. But it's actually been quite the opposite. Very shortly after this news broke, a lot of Trump allies began alleging that Eric Adams had actually been politically targeted by the Justice Department.
But yeah, because just to be clear, it's the Justice Department that brought these charges, and it has to do or federal charges, and these are around bribery, wire fraud, seeking illegal campaign contributions. And we should also say that Adams has vigorously denied these allegations and said that he is not guilty of committing a crime.
Yeah, and his relations with Turkish interests and basically allegedly taking benefits from them and, quid pro quos and everything like that. And so these Trump allies looked at this and they basically said, Eric Adams is being targeted by the Justice Department because he was a bad Democrat. Like Eric Adams in recent years has said things that don't sound like much of the Democratic Party when it comes to migrants that were flowing into New York, about crime, saying things that aren't exactly on the same page as his party. So they've argued that this Democrat is being persecuted. And I think it's a reflection, too, of the growing number of indictments of prominent Democrats. Like, if Trump is out here saying the Justice Department is weaponized against his side, how do you explain all these indictments of Democrats like Bob Menendez, former senator from New Jersey, Democratic Congressman Henry Cuellar from Texas, and of course the indictments of Hunter Biden as well? Like, how do you explain these things? And they seem to have kind of evolved in this conspiracy theory that the Justice Department is now going after bad Democrats too, which I think is just kind of a wild thing. And it also—
Just to be clear, what has Trump said about this?
So Trump yesterday at a news conference, when Adams first began criticizing the migrant influx in his city or complaining about it and the federal resources that he was getting, Trump claims that he predicted at that time that Adams would ultimately be indicted.
I will say this. I watched about a year ago when he talked about how the illegal migrants are hurting our city and the federal government should pay us and we shouldn't have to take him. And I said, you know what? He'll be indicted within a year. And I was exactly right.
I should note that that wasn't a hugely ambitious prediction to the extent Trump actually made it. Like, we knew as of late last year that Adams was being investigated. There were searches and seizures that were taking place. So, Adams has been kind of courting these problems for a long time. But I think, the fact that Trump kind of lines up to, give this guy a vote of confidence, I think is just reflective of how the Republican Party kind of on a knee-jerk basis goes after these conspiracy theories about Justice Department being weaponized against critics.
Liz, are you hearing that in this among senators as well?
So it's definitely nothing compared to the Trump conviction where everybody released a statement saying this is horrible, our country is,
all the Republicans,
in shambles.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it was interesting after the Hunter Biden trial, there were a few Republicans who said, well, I don't think he should have been charged either, which was kind of interesting. There's some people who will just take this stance that the Justice Department is horribly flawed now. And then, if you try to ask, well, they are going after Democrats too, they just criticize those prosecutions as well.
Yeah, and I guess that's the argument to make when you're presented with, well, they can't be just in it for Democrats because, look, they're going after all these Democrats. And so I guess it would make sense. I mean, on the other hand, I'm just it seems ripe for attacks from Republicans. Here's a mayor of a major liberal city charged with criminal activity.
Yeah, and that would seem to be the go-to in this situation. But Adams is also somebody who over the years has gotten kind of a following among conservatives. He is not a down-the-line liberal Democrat in the way that you'd expect in a city like New York. And so when he was campaigning even back in 2021 for the job, he did get some kind of, love from Fox News and the like, because he was not that far left character and kind of said things that were not helpful for the Democratic Party more broadly. So it's been a lot of really interesting dynamics that have been taking place. And and by the way, I would also add, we don't know right now what's going to happen with this. There's a lot of question about whether Adams is going to resign. The governor, Kathy Hochul, could actually remove him if she wanted to. That's legal in New York. If he is removed, there will be a race unlike anything that I think a lot of people have ever seen, which is a nonpartisan race with ranked choice.
Oh.
So there will be many dozens of candidates running and people ranking their choices, and whoever kind of emerges from a very lengthy and complicated process will become the next new mayor of New York, which I think would be a fascinating exercise at the very least.
And so much for New Yorkers to deal with. New York people living in New York City, like how many campaigns are they going to have to wade through? So now let's turn to the vice presidential debate. This is next Tuesday. It's probably the only one that's going to happen. It's hosted by CBS News, and it'll be between Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, he's on the Democratic ticket, J.D. Vance, the Republican senator from Ohio, who is Trump's running mate. Aaron, what are you going to be looking for?
Yeah, I think I'm probably more excited about this debate than anybody in America right now. I think I've talked about that before, but I just imagine this being even more fascinating than the presidential debate last month, or I guess earlier this month. What is time? I just think the contrast of styles is going to be fascinating. This kind of blue-collar, Minnesota Democrat and this Ivy League educated, Trumpy Republican. Walz is very kind of combative. J.D. Vance is kind of proven that he's willing to say anything politically. I just think there's going to be tons of fireworks in this debate and two candidates who really don't like each other very much. And I think we're all going to be talking about this plenty after the debate on Tuesday.
Liz, since you've been covering the Senate for a while and Vance as a senator, what should we know about his debate style and what will you be looking for as you watch this?
Yeah, so Vance, I think he's actually pretty comfortable in settings with a bunch of reporters like in the Capitol. So I was actually really surprised when he, as a vice presidential candidate, he would have sort of awkward moments or seem, when he was talking to a crowd and he would kind of make a joke and it falls flat and he can't really recover that gracefully. There were a lot of these moments that made him seem very untested on the national stage, I would say. And in the halls of the Capitol, he really doesn't come across that way. He's sort of almost like a pundit of sorts. Like he's been on like a million podcasts and he's done so many interviews. He's very comfortable speaking like extemporaneously to reporters. And he seems to have like a confidence that felt like it got a little shaken once he got so much on the national stage. Trump had that thing where he was asked, oh, are you worried about him dragging you down? And he was sort of like, no one cares about the vice president.
Yeah.
And so that's kind
a
of
telling
like
comment if there ever was one.
Yeah.
So it's like a weird place to be. I think it's shaken him a little bit, the way he seems on the stage. So I'm not really sure what to expect. If you had asked me right when he was picked, I would have said, I think he's going to be a great debater because all he does is kind of explain his ideas in these podcasts and to reporters, and has sort of like an intellectual sheen to his worldview that he's confident defending. But now I'm not so sure because I feel like he's been a little bit shook up.
I'm curious now how he's going to do against Tim Walz, who also has like his own communication style.
Yeah, I mean, I think Walz, I think the risk for him is like, does he go too off the wall? Does he go too far?
Too off the walls?
Yeah.
Sorry, I had to do it.
Exactly. No, that was like malpractice that I didn't do it. So yeah, I think like he's, he can be a bit of a live wire, basically. Yeah. And I think if you're Harris, I think they're running a little bit more cautiously anyway. You don't want your VP like making news in a bad way. And I think that's the risk for him.
Yeah, I mean, the backdrop of this is that Republicans have spent a lot of time attacking Tim Walz, and that doesn't seem to have landed. Like, Walz is still more popular than unpopular, and Vance is pretty far unpopular, like double digits in most polls. So there's a big gap between these two candidates right now, and so the debate's going to be interesting in that way. But to Liz's point on Walz, this is a guy who is kind of a live wire. He hasn't done a whole lot of unscripted moments in interviews and things like that. And I think he has proven that he's, he can kind of get out over his skis a little bit. I'm thinking back to very early in the campaign after he was chosen, where he went up on stage and made that comment about J.D. Vance and the couch.
I can't wait to debate the guy. That is, if he's willing to get off the couch and show up. So.
And then he followed that up by saying,
"You see what I did there?
Which, can we explain somehow what that means?
The couch, we have to explain the couch thing again. There's an internet rumor about J.D. Vance doing certain things with a couch that are not true, but
And is explicit.
And the Harris campaign has kind of subtly alluded to these things, and people on social media have been having fun with them. And so Walz was very much intending to do that here, but in a very plausibly deniable way. And then he basically drove home exactly what he was doing by saying, "You see what I did there," which was not, according to a source I talked to, was not in his prepared remarks. And so I think there is a thought that Walz is a little bit excitable, and maybe when he's in these unscripted moments, he might get a little bit too excitable. And so I think that's certainly something to watch out for in this debate.
And, I always have to ask the question, the do debates actually matter question. I feel like, okay, the one between Trump and Biden, that certainly mattered. But, last week on the show, we talked about the impact of the Trump-Harris debate and just generally speaking, how much do debates actually move the needle? Do either of you think that this debate could have a material impact on the race at this point, Liz?
Yeah, I mean, my first instinct would always be to say no, right? A VP debate, a material impact on the race, like no. But this race has just been so wild, and we did have a debate completely transform our entire election. And I think these VPs have been way more center stage than anyone since Sarah Palin that I can think of. So people actually are very curious about these people. I think they've become avatars for what each side sort of hates about the other side. Vance much more so, since he's taken this huge popularity hit with his comments about cat ladies and all that. But Walz too, I think that for Republicans, there's a real animus there. They just seem to have been more of like a target of people's like love and hate than past VPs.
Yeah, and the way I look at it is this going to shift the polls by 5 points? Of course not. That's not going to happen. Even Biden's bad debate performance didn't immediately shift the polls by a whole lot. But I think what these debates tend to do is they help kind of craft the narrative for the campaign ahead, or they point to vulnerabilities that each campaign might have that over the course of the next several weeks can matter. And so to the extent that J.D. Vance is reminding people what they don't like about the Republican ticket, that matters. To the extent, maybe Republicans can land a glove on Walz in a way that they haven't before, that can also matter in giving people concerns about the Democratic ticket and maybe how far left it is. Things like that aren't necessarily registering immediately, but they can matter later in the campaign. And of course, we have had such close elections that every little thing counts, even if it's not going to be something that changes the race outside the margin of error.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. That is it for today's episode. Liz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Aaron, I'm going to see you next week after this debate.
Yeah, we'll see you then. And don't forget to subscribe to the Campaign Moment newsletter.
You can find a link to the Campaign Moment newsletter in our show notes and at postreports.com. Liz Goodwin covers Congress for The Post, and Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter.
If you're tuning in via Post Reports, we'll keep bringing you these conversations most Fridays until Election Day. But we have other episodes that you can only hear by following the Campaign Moment podcast feed itself. So be sure to look that up wherever you're listening.
Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and mixed by Sam Bair. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy. Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Monica Campbell, Ted Muldoon, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Rennie Svirnovsky, Allison Michaels, Renita Jablonski, and Martine Powers. I'm Elahe Izadi.
And I'm Aaron Blake.
Aaron, have a great weekend.
You too.